Welcome back to the Everything History podcast for episode 33, The Appearance, Person, and Habits of Augustus Caesar. This episode diverges from my narrative of the great Roman emperor, but only to divulge the information about the man himself. And with that, let's begin.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Now, as I said, I will describe in this episode the more personal habits of Augustus. Those details are commonly left untouched by historians and teachers for whatever reason. And when it comes to his appearance, I'm not talking about his appearance on art. That is very much studied. I'm referring to how the man looked in real life. And often such details are left aside because they aren't often recorded, and it's usually a universal constant across historical cultures that people only commission idealized versions of themselves. So when you look up Augustus Caesar, you will always see him in his youth, and usually with an Alexandrian pose, meaning a pose where the subject is looking past the audience, presumably at something more important, and with the mouth slightly open and the body poised gracefully. If you're curious, the Augustus Prima Porta shows him in this idealized manner. Yet the Romans were unique when it came to sculpture, especially during the Republican era. Early and middle Roman sculpture is known for depicting reality, and this was the case because Romans took reality very seriously, and their conservative culture treated art as a practical extension of reality. This is in opposition to the Greeks, who often used art to show perfection and myth. Thus the Roman sculpture was very practical and highly realistic. So men were shown with wrinkles, scars, receding hairlines, and all manner of imperfections because the sculpture was meant to be realistic. By the time of Augustus Caesar, however, this tradition had waned somewhat. You can still find realistic portrayals of Augustus, but only during his youth. This is due in part to the passage of time, and partially to Augustus's control of his own image. Yet the Roman practice of realism in sculpture would last for centuries after Augustus. But aside from sculpture, we have a detailed account of Augustus's appearance and habits by Suetonius. I'll discuss Suetonius in a moment, but the question I've been working towards, though, is why is understanding such personal details important to knowing Augustus Caesar and his place in history? I assert that it is important because it allows us to comprehend the motives of the man, and as you will find in this episode, knowing such details humanizes historical characters. And when you read, learn, or listen about Augustus Caesar, the man, thousands of years distant from us, legitimately seems like some sort of demigod because of his actions. His actions led to the end of the period of civil wars, the formation of the Roman Principate and Empire, and he lived to the age of 76 over 2,000 years ago. The man is rightfully a legend of history, but by learning about his daily life we can deconstruct, or at least get a glimpse at, what he was really like, and allow you and I to sympathize and understand the nature of the man behind the name of Augustus. Now, I alluded to the ancient writer and biographer Suetonius a few moments ago. Suetonius seems to have written his biographies of the Caesars, entitled The 12 Caesars, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian during the early 2nd century CE. I mention that just to remind you of the large gap in time between his biography of Augustus and the actual life of Augustus. Nevertheless, the time between Augustus and Suetonius was a relative golden age in the Roman world, so it is entirely possible and likely that Suetonius had a great amount of terrific sources because he actually worked and at one point oversaw the libraries of Emperor Hadrian himself. Suetonius, though, it must be said, was quite unique in his style and was far more of a biographer than a historian. As I have mentioned a few episodes previous, he's also a bit of a gossip. Yes, Suetonius often recorded the more interesting or scandalous accounts of an event or a person's life rather than the most accurate version. But actually, when you read his work, those flaws are not so glaring, actually. And I will be relying on his biography heavily, but I will not be citing any of his controversial or scandalous bits. I will begin with Augustus's appearance and body. It is worth noting that all modern societies value appearance. They value different traits, but it is nonetheless a fact. And the societies of the ancient Mediterranean world did as well, but the Romans valued physical appearance quite differently. Throughout Roman and Greek society, they took appearance generally at face value, and were not shy about stating their disgust for those who were ugly, mutated, or otherwise deformed. The Greeks especially held the belief that if you were beautiful or handsome, you were also a good person, and vice versa for ugly people. The Romans generally agreed with the Greeks, but, of course, it should be said that if one proved themselves to be despicable, vile, evil, or in any way false, then that is how they would be perceived thereafter. Augustus himself shows an example of this with his daughter Julia. His daughter was a handsome woman and a highly esteemed Roman lady as the daughter of Augustus, but after she was caught and found guilty of adultery and many other forms of debauchery, Augustus exiled her and denounced her to all, essentially disowning her. And that was the daughter of the great Augustus. Imagine a similar scenario for a Roman slave, freeman, or plebeian. So suffice it to say, it was very important to have a favorable appearance, or at least a normal appearance. It was not necessary to be a pretty boy as a Roman man. In fact, it was not desired, but birth defects or disabilities were generally a deal breaker for the Roman people. There are exceptions to such a rule, for example Emperor Claudius, but usually only because they were from the patrician class. Regardless, I now quote an entire section from Suetonius on the appearance of Augustus Caesar. Quote, "He was unusually handsome and exceedingly graceful, though he cared nothing for personal adornment. He was so far from being particular about the dressing of his hair that he would often have several barbers working in a hurry at the same time. As for his beard, he kept it clipped and now shaved, while at the very same time he would either be reading or writing something. His expression, whether he was in conversation or when he was silent, was calm and mild. He had clear, bright eyes, but in his old age he could not see very well with his left eye. His teeth were wide apart, small and ill-kept. His hair was slightly curly, inclining to the golden. His eyebrows met, his ears were of moderate size, and his nose projected a little at the top and then bent slightly inward. His complexion was between dark and fair. He was short of stature, although Julius Marthus, his freedman and keeper of records, says that he was 5 foot 7 inches in height. But this was concealed by the fine proportion and symmetry of his figure, and it was noticeable only by comparison with some taller person standing beside him." End quote. Now allow me to clarify Suetonius a little bit, because some of his description was vague and some of it was very specific. And be aware that Suetonius is getting this information secondhand, although it is clear that he had access to the records of Augustus and that the emperor himself made note of his own appearance. From Suetonius, we can get a clear picture of the man from his hair to nose to his height. I only want to clarify the remarks on Caesar's brow and his height. Suetonius noted that, quote, "his eyebrows met," meaning that Caesar was capable of growing what we would call a unibrow. But I only wanted to explain that Suetonius is describing Caesar's personal and private appearance. So when left to his own devices and without having to attend public celebrations or meetings, Caesar's hair would often be disheveled and haphazard, and he would let his eyebrows meet. This is stated by Suetonius to show that Caesar was not obsessed with his figure. He was obsessed with his work, like a true Roman was supposed to be. But when Augustus exited private life, he would clean himself up for appearance's sake, including the brow. Suetonius also noted the height of Augustus at 5'7", and that is in modern inches. I already translated it, because in Roman inches he was actually 5'9". Suetonius seems to doubt this number, though, but he also has the habit of trying to poke fun at the people he writes about, and most likely Caesar was around 5'6" to 5'7" in modern estimates. This is an average height to Romans because they were generally healthier than people from the Middle Ages all the way to the 19th century, but not as healthy as the average modern person. Suetonius then discusses the body and constitution, meaning the health, of Augustus, and keep in mind that Suetonius is detailing Augustus from his youth to old age. Most often, though, he's referring to the description of Caesar during his middle-aged years. This is a long, continuous passage. Quote, "It is said that his body was covered with spots, and that he had birthmarks scattered across his breast and belly, corresponding in form, order, and number with the stars of the bear in the heavens. Also numerous callous places resembling ringworm, caused by a constant itching of his body and a vigorous use of the strigil." End quote. I interrupt to note that the stars of the bear is a reference to the constellation Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, and that a strigil is a curved blade used to wipe dirt and sweat off the body, commonly used in ancient gymnasia. Continuing with the passage, quote, "Augustus was not very strong in his left hip, thigh, and leg, and even limped slightly at times, but he strengthened them by treatment with sand and reed. He also sometimes found the forefinger of his right hand so weak when it was numb and shrunken with the cold that he could hardly use it for writing. He complained of his bladder too, and was relieved of the pain only after passing stones in his urine." In the course of his life, he suffered from several severe and dangerous illnesses, especially after the subjugation of northern Hispania, when he was in such a desperate plight from the abscesses of the liver that he was forced to submit to an unprecedented and hazardous course of treatment. He also experienced some disorders which recurred every year at definite times, for he was commonly ailing just before his birthday, and at the beginning of spring he was troubled with an enlargement of the diaphragm, and when the wind was in the south, with catarrh. Hence his constitution was so weakened that he could not readily endure either cold or heat. In winter he protected himself with 4 tunics and a heavy toga, besides an undershirt, a woolen chest protector, and wraps for his thighs and shins, while in summer he slept with the doors of his bedroom open, oftentimes in the open court near a fountain. Yet he could not endure the sun even in winter, and never walked in the open air without wearing a broad-brimmed hat, even at home. He traveled in a litter, usually at night, but if he could reach his destination by sea, he preferred to sail. Yet in spite of his sickness, he made good of his weakness by great care, especially by moderation in bathing. For example, when he had to use hot salt water and sulfur baths for his rheumatism, he contented himself with sitting on a wooden bath seat, which he called by the Spanish name dereta. End quote. So you can clearly see that health was a major concern throughout Augustus' life, from his youth to his elderly years. I now shift to Suetonius' remarks on how Augustus managed friendships. Quote, "He did not readily make friends, but he clung to them with the utmost constancy, not only suitably rewarding their virtues, but even condoning their faults, provided they were not too great. All his close friends continued to enjoy power and wealth to the end of their lives, each holding a leading place in his own class, although sometimes differences arose. In return for his friendship, he demanded his friends' affection on their part, both in life and after death. For though he was in no sense a legacy hunter, and in fact could never bring himself to accept anything from the will of a stranger, he was highly sensitive in weighing the deathbed utterances of his friends, concealing neither his chagrin if he was left a meagre bequest, or one unaccompanied by compliments, nor his satisfaction if he was praised in terms of gratitude and affection. Whenever legacies or shares of inheritance were left to him by men of any station who had offspring, he either turned them over to the children at once, or, if they were too young, paid the money back with interest on the day when they assumed the gown of manhood or married." End quote. As for Augustus's domestic life, Suetonius writes, quote, "He lived at first near the Roman Forum, above the stairs of the ringmakers, in a house which had belonged to the orator Callus. Afterwards he lived on the Palatine Hill, but in the modest dwelling of Hortensius, which was remarkable neither for size nor elegance. For more than 40 years, too, he used the same bedroom in winter and summer, although he found the city unfavorable to his health in the winter, yet he continued to winter there. If ever he planned to do anything in private or without interruption, he retired to a place at the top of the house, which he called Syracuse. But often when he was not well, he slept at his friend Maecenas' house. For retirement he went most frequently to places by the sea and the islands of Campania, or to the towns near Rome. Augustus disliked large and sumptuous country palaces, actually razing to the ground one which his granddaughter Julia had built on a lavish scale. His own villas, which were modest enough, he decorated not so much with handsome statues and pictures, but with terraces, groves, and objects noteworthy for their antiquity and rarity." End quote. And Suetonius also notes that not only did Augustus choose simple housing, but he also abhorred lavish furnishes as well, stating, quote, "The simplicity of his furniture and household goods may be seen from the couches and tables still in existence, many of which are scarcely fine enough for even a private citizen. They say that he always slept on a low and plainly furnished bed. He wore common clothes, except on special occasions, made by his sister, wife, daughter, or granddaughters. His togas were neither close nor full, his purple stripe neither narrow nor broad, and his shoes somewhat high-soled to make him look taller than he really was. But he always kept shoes and clothing to wear in public, ready in his room for sudden and unexpected occasions." End quote. Now I shift to when Suetonius discusses the eating habits of Caesar. Quote, "He was a light eater, for I would not omit even this detail, and as a rule ate only plain food. He particularly liked coarse bread, small fishes, hand-made moist cheese, and green figs of the second crop. And he would often eat even before dinner, wherever and whenever he felt hungry." End quote. Suetonius then quoted a letter of Caesar's to his stepson Tiberius, a letter that is lost to us, that says, quote, "Not even a Jew, my dear Tiberius, fasts so scrupulously on his Sabbath as I have today. For it was not until after the first hour of the night that I ate 2 mouthfuls of bread in the bath before I began to be anointed." End quote. And Suetonius continues, quote, "Because of this irregularity, he sometimes ate alone either before a dinner party began or after it was over, touching nothing while it was in progress, and he was by nature most sparing also in his use of wine. Cornelius Nepos writes that in camp before Mutina, it was his habit to drink not more than 3 times at dinner. Afterwards, when he indulged most freely, he never exceeded a pint, or if he did, he used to throw it up. He liked ration wine the best, but rarely drank before dinner. Instead, he would take a bit of bread soaked in cold water, a slice of cucumber, a sprig of young lettuce, or an apple with tart flavor, either fresh or dried. After his midday meal, he used to rest for a while just as he was, without taking off his clothes or his shoes, with his feet uncovered and his hands to his eyes. After dinner, he went to a couch in his study where he remained too late at night until he had attended to what was left of the day's business, either wholly or in great part. Then when he went to bed and slept not more than 7 hours at most, and not even that length of time without a break, but waking 3 or 4 times. If he could not resume his sleep when it was interrupted, as would happen, he sent for readers or storytellers, and when sleep came to him, he often prolonged it until after daylight. He would never lie awake in the dark without having someone sit by his side. He detested early rising, and when he had to get up earlier than usual because of some official or religious duty, to avoid inconveniencing himself, he spent the night in the room of one of his friends near the appointed place. Even so, he often suffered from want of sleep, and he would often drop off while he was being carried through the streets and when his litter was set down because of some delay." End quote. The last section of Augustus's life I'm going to cover is his relationship, oration, rhetoric, and language. Augustus took rhetoric and oration very seriously, and if you recall from the intro episode to Augustus, then you will recall that he studied in Greece. There he cultivated an interest in Greek poetry and Greek liberal studies under his teacher Apollodorus of Pergamon. This stayed with him throughout his life. Suetonius states, quote, "He devoted himself eagerly and with the utmost diligence to oratory and liberal studies. During the war at Mutina, amid such oppressive affairs, he is said to have read, written, and declaimed every day." End quote. Caesar formed a habit of speaking accurately in his youth as well, and by that I mean Augustus was very calculating when he spoke, so much so that after the events of Mutina, Suetonius tells us that, quote, "He never afterwards spoke in the Senate or to the people or to the soldiers except in a studied and written address." Although he did not lack the gift of speaking offhand without preparation, moreover, to avoid the danger of forgetting what he was to say, or wasting time in committing it to memory, he adopted the practice of reading everything from a manuscript. Even his conversations with individuals, and the more important of those with his own wife Livia, he always wrote out and read from a notebook, for fear of saying too much or too little if he spoke offhand. He had an agreeable and rather charismatic enunciation, and he practiced constantly with a teacher of elocution. But sometimes, because of weakness of the throat, he addressed the people through a herald. End quote. As for his writing, Suetonius tells us that Augustus wrote more than just speeches and conversation scripts. He also dabbled in prose and poetry, but the emperor gave it up, quote, "because his style did not satisfy him." End quote. So you can get a hint there that Caesar was very hard on himself and was not delusional about his own abilities. Suetonius also details Augustus's personal style when it comes to style in both writing and speaking, one that I quite agree with, by the way. Quote, "He cultivated a style of speaking that was chaste and elegant, avoiding the vanity of attempts at epigram and artificial order, and as he himself expressed it, the noisiness of far-fetched words, making it his chief aim to express his thoughts as clearly as possible. With this end in mind, to avoid confusing and checking his reader or hearer at any point, he did not hesitate to use prepositions with names of cities, nor to repeat conjunctions several times, the omission of which causes some obscurity, though it adds grace. He looked on innovators and archaizers with equal contempt, as faulty in opposite directions, and he sometimes had a fling at them, in particular his friend Maecenas, whose ungaunt, dripping curls, as he calls them, he loses no opportunity of belaboring and pokes fun at them by parody. He did not spare even Tiberius, who sometimes hunted up obsolete and pedantic expressions, and as for Mark Antony, he calls him a madman for writing rather to be admired than to be understood, then going on to ridicule his perverse and inconsistent taste in choosing an oratorical style. And in a letter praising the talent of his granddaughter Agrippina, he writes, "But you must take great care not to write and talk affectedly." End quote. As a final note, Suetonius informs us of the expressions that Caesar was fond of. Quote, "that in his everyday conversation he used certain favorite and peculiar expressions that he said and wrote every now and then. When he wished to indicate that certain men will never pay, he said that they will pay on the Greek kalends. When he urged his correspondent to put up with the present circumstances such as they were, he would say, 'Let's be satisfied with the Cato we have.' And when he wanted to express the speed of hasty actions, he would often say, 'quicker than you can cook asparagus.'" End quote. So there you have it. Augustus was a man who preferred simple food and simple housing. And ask yourself why he would choose such a lifestyle. Was it entirely out of preference, or was it a political move to not seem too grandiose? I am inclined to believe both, with emphasis on the former because he really did seem to have a genuine distaste for luxury. We have also learned that Augustus had a naturally weak constitution and body, but despite his poor health and his great trials, he lived to the age of 76 years old. Suetonius also gives us a peek behind the curtain on how Augustus thought, conducted himself, treated his friends and family, and a lot of other small personal details that made the man unique. Now, I'll end this episode there, and hopefully you have a better understanding of the man that was Octavian, not the princeps imperator that was Augustus. In next episode, we will step entirely away from the personal and continue the historical narrative of Octavian as the mutinous civil war closes and the creation of the Second Triumvirate approaches. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I point you to the email everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.